Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I'll never forget the first day we brought him home. You know, I always thought the feeling of finally having a child would be one of pure joy, happiness, excitement. But when Caleb stepped through the door for the first time, it felt like something other was standing there with him. It wasn't him exactly, but the weight of the silence that followed him in, like a shadow stretching across the room. The house was ready. We had spent months preparing for this day, buying toys, decorating the room, setting up everything a child might need. It was supposed to be perfect, a fresh start, a new chapter for our family. But when Caleb's eyes met mine for the first time, I felt a chill run through me. His dark eyes didn't meet mine with warmth or curiosity. They were empty, as if he were looking right through me. I reached out to him, offering my hand, trying to make the first connection, but he didn't move. "Hi, Caleb, welcome home." I thought maybe he just needed time. I didn't understand the depth of it then, not yet. But I would soon. Peter, always the logical one, smiled nervously as he stood behind me. He tried to keep the mood light, ushering Caleb toward the stairs. "Your room's upstairs. It's all ready." But Caleb didn't look up. He didn't even glance at the new bed or the toys waiting for him. His small frame shuffled forward, his gaze still locked somewhere far away. It wasn't normal. A child, any child, would at least look around, wouldn't they? They'd be curious, even a little overwhelmed. But Caleb? He wasn't curious about anything. He was like a shadow, moving through the house but not really there. When we finally got him settled in his room, I tried to speak with him. I told him that we were here to take care of him, that he was safe now, but there was nothing. He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge me. He just sat there, staring at the wall, his hand idly tracing shapes in the air. But what shook me to my core wasn't just his silence. It was the way his silence seemed to feel. It felt heavy. I couldn't explain it, but something about him, about his stillness, made the air in the room feel thick, like I was suffocating. Like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. That night, we tried to sleep, Peter and I, but the house was too quiet. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks, whispers, distant, as if coming from far away. But when I turned to Peter, he was already asleep. He didn't hear them, and that made me feel even more alone. I had no idea what was really going on. I thought it was just the nerves, the anticipation of finally having a child, maybe the stress of the adoption process catching up with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Something was wrong with Caleb. The next day, I found the drawings. He had started small, on scraps of paper at first. I thought they were innocent enough, just a child's attempt at creativity. But when I saw the walls of his room covered in them, that's when I knew something wasn't right. These weren't just doodles. These were messages. The shapes, the figures, the faces twisted in pain. It was as though they were begging for something. There were symbols I couldn't understand, things I didn't want to understand. And the worst part? Caleb was the one drawing them. But when I asked him about it, he just stared at me, his eyes cold, hollow. He said nothing. The whispers began that same night. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the house settling. But then they came again, louder this time, and I could hear them clearly. They weren't words exactly, just low, guttural sounds that seemed to wrap themselves around me, dragging me into the darkness. I got out of bed, my heart racing, and tiptoed down the hall to Caleb's room. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. He was sitting there again in the same corner, staring out the window. But this time he was whispering too, his lips moving, forming words, but no sound came. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could feel it. There was something in the air, something thick and suffocating. And then I heard it. "You should have never come here." The voice came from him, but it wasn't Caleb's voice. It was deeper, darker, like something crawling out from the depths of the earth. My blood ran cold and I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off him. But it wasn't Caleb's face I was looking at anymore. No, it was something else. Something much older. Something that had been waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but when I turned to leave I heard it again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have taken him." I ran back to our bedroom and slammed the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Peter woke up, his eyes wide with confusion, but I couldn't even speak. The whispers echoed in my head, drowning out everything else. That was when I called Margaret. She wasn't like us. She could sense things, see things that others couldn't. She'd always been the odd one out in the family, but when I told her what was happening, what was really happening, she didn't hesitate. She said she'd come over to help. I should have known. I should have realized sooner that it wasn't just a boy we brought home. It wasn't just an innocent child who had been through too much. No, this thing inside him, it was something darker, something vengeful. Margaret arrived that night, and the moment she stepped inside, she stopped. Her eyes widened, and she muttered something under her breath. I could see the color drain from her face, and I knew. She could feel it too. That's when she told us the truth. Caleb wasn't just a child, he was the vessel, the spirit that had been waiting. And it wasn't looking for peace. It wasn't looking for love, it was looking for revenge. And it had already started. I'll never forget the first day we brought him home. There was something about the quiet of that day, a hush that settled over everything. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. Adoption was supposed to be filled with excitement, joy, hope. But when Caleb stepped through the door, it wasn't just a child we brought into the house. It was something else. It was like the air itself thickened, the house holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. He didn't speak when he entered. There was no smile, no nervous fidgeting, not even a glance at the house around him. His eyes, dark and wide, remained fixed on the floor. He didn't look at me or Peter, and when he did finally lift his gaze, it wasn't with the curiosity I expected from a child. His stare was blank, distant, as if we were nothing but shadows moving in the corner of his vision. Peter, trying to break the tension, smiled and pointed toward the stairs. "Your room's upstairs, Caleb. We've got it all ready for you." But Caleb didn't acknowledge him, didn't even nod. He just walked past us like he was already lost in another world, like he wasn't really here. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe he just needed time. I was so desperate for him to fit in, to be the child I'd dreamed of. But something was already wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks, whispers. At first, I thought it was the house settling, but then the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and went down the hall to Caleb's room. His door was cracked open, and through the sliver I saw him, sitting by the window, staring out into the night. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Then, from the darkness of the room, I heard it. "You should have never come here." I froze. It wasn't Caleb's voice. It was deeper, guttural, like something crawling out from under the earth. My blood ran cold, and before I could move, the door slammed shut on its own, as if the house itself was trying to keep me away. I backed away slowly, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. The next day it started, the drawings. I found the first one on the kitchen table, a crude, sketchy thing. At first, I thought it was just a random doodle, something a child might do to pass the time. But when I looked closer, my heart skipped a beat. It was a face, a pair of hollow eyes, drawn with such precision, such care, that it sent a chill down my spine. The eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. I felt them burn into me, like they were looking right through me. At first, I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a child's imagination. Maybe he was working through something he couldn't express. But when I found the second one the next day, pinned to the wall above his bed, I couldn't ignore it any longer. This time, the face wasn't just a face. It was wrong. It was like the figure was twisting, contorting, almost as if it were stretching itself across the page, trying to escape. The edges were jagged, sharp. Not the innocent lines of a child's drawing, but the angry strokes of something darker. I felt it then, the air in the room thickening, the silence turning heavy, like something was suffocating us. The whispers started again. Low at first, just a murmur, but then it grew louder, until it was impossible to ignore. I walked closer to the drawing, my breath shallow, and as I leaned in I could hear it clearer now, not Caleb's voice, but something else. I could barely make it out. "You shouldn't have come here." My heart pounded in my chest. I turned around, feeling the weight of the room closing in on me. I called Peter, but his dismissive answer did nothing to calm the storm building inside me. "It's just a kid's scribble, Anna. He's been through a lot. Let him express himself." But that voice wasn't Caleb's. That night, when the whispers became too loud to ignore, I woke Peter. "I need you to come with me," I said, my voice trembling. We crept down the hallway toward Caleb's room. The door was slightly ajar, and when I peered inside, I saw him again, sitting in the corner, facing the wall. His body was still, unnaturally still, as if he had been frozen in time, but his hand was moving, sketching something on the floor. I took a step into the room, and Caleb didn't move. He didn't acknowledge us, didn't even blink. "Caleb?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. The only sound in the room was the soft scrape of his pencil against the paper. Peter stepped forward, trying to break the silence, but it was as if Caleb couldn't hear him. And then, without warning, Caleb's head turned slowly, excruciatingly slow, until his eyes locked onto Peter's. They were dark, so dark, like empty voids, swallowing everything in their path. And just for a moment I saw it, the flicker of something else, something other. It wasn't Caleb anymore. It was something much older, much darker, something far beyond the innocent child we had hoped for. Before I could even speak, Caleb's hand dropped the pencil. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, the sound too loud in the silence of the room. And then he turned back to the wall, his pencil moving again, faster this time, almost feverishly. The drawing on the wall stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't just a face anymore. It wasn't just a figure. It was something else entirely. A grotesque, twisted version of Caleb's own face. His eyes wide open, but there was something unnatural about them. The mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that looked more like a snarl. The darkness in those eyes was so thick it felt like it was seeping into the room, into my soul. Peter stepped back, his face pale, eyes wide. "Anna, this isn't just drawings. This isn't normal. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I looked at the drawings again, the symbols surrounding them, the strange language that twisted and turned. It wasn't just a child's scribbles anymore. It was a message. And it wasn't from Caleb. It was from something else. Something that had been waiting. Something that was still here. I felt the whispers again, louder now, rising from the walls, from Caleb. The voice was clearer, and I understood it now. It wasn't just help me. It was something far more sinister. Help me. You shouldn't have come here. And then, the message grew clearer still, as if the walls themselves were speaking, as if the house was alive, listening. Run. It started quietly, like a whisper at the back of my mind, a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. When we adopted Caleb, I thought it would be the beginning of something wonderful, something healing. But from the moment he stepped into our home, it felt like the house itself had held its breath, waiting for something. And I didn't realize it then, but it was waiting for him. The first night Caleb was with us, I remember watching him, wondering how it would feel to have him in our home, to have the child we'd dreamed of for so long. But there was no excitement in his eyes, no curiosity, just that deep, endless silence. He didn't smile when I greeted him, didn't acknowledge us at all. He was just there. The first thing that really unsettled me was the drawing. It was small, barely noticeable at first, just a scrap of paper left on the kitchen table. But when I looked closer, my blood ran cold. It was a face, but not just any face. A face with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. At first, I thought it was just a child's scribble, the kind of thing any kid would draw when they were bored. But the eyes, their emptiness, it felt wrong. It felt like the eyes were watching me. And that should have been the first sign, shouldn't it? But I was too eager to dismiss it, too desperate to believe it was just a child's imagination. Over the next few days, I found more of them, drawings everywhere. They weren't just innocent little doodles, they were disturbing, twisted things. Faces, twisted, contorted faces, pinned to the walls. Eyes that bled, hands reaching out from the page like they were trying to pull me in, and the symbols, I didn't know what they meant, but the longer I stared at them, the more I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. One night I heard him. Caleb. He wasn't speaking, but I heard him whispering. No, it wasn't Caleb's voice. It was deeper. Something else was speaking through him. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the whispers, oh, they weren't just wind. They were words, distorted, guttural, like something crawling out from beneath the earth. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to see what was happening. That night, when Peter fell asleep beside me, I slipped out of bed, my skin prickling with an unease I couldn't explain. I crept down the hallway toward Caleb's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could feel the cold from inside seeping through the crack. I pushed it open, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around, to go back. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. When I stepped inside, I saw him, Caleb, sitting there, facing the wall, his body unnaturally still. His hands were in his lap, fingers twitching slightly. His back was rigid, and he didn't even turn when I called his name. But I didn't need him to turn. I could feel it. Something was wrong. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, but before I could say another word, he slowly, unnaturally slowly, turned his head, and when his eyes met mine, I felt the air freeze around me. Those eyes, those dark, empty eyes, they weren't Caleb's. They were hollow, black holes that sucked in the light, that sucked in everything. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at him, at the thing that wasn't Caleb anymore, the thing that had taken his place. And then it spoke. Not Caleb, something else. The voice was low, guttural, like it came from the depths of the earth. It rumbled through the walls, through the floor beneath my feet, vibrating in my bones. You shouldn't have come here. I nearly collapsed. I wanted to run. I wanted to get away from that thing, from those eyes, from the whispers that filled the room and swirled around me like a storm. But I couldn't. I was trapped. The air was so thick I could barely breathe. My heart raced in my chest, a rapid, frantic beat that seemed to echo in the silence of the room. Before I could gather my bearings, the thing, Caleb's body, spoke again. You took him. Now you must pay. It was like a weight had been thrown over me. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in from all sides. I staggered back, reaching for the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't move. The door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had become a prison, trapping me in with whatever was inside Caleb. I pressed my body against the door, my hands shaking, but the wood felt cold, solid, unyielding. And then the whispers grew louder, louder and louder, until it felt like they were inside my head, filling my mind, suffocating me. Run. You should have run when you had the chance. But I couldn't run. I couldn't do anything. The door wouldn't open. I was trapped. And then, as if the house had grown tired of my struggle, the door finally gave way, swinging open with a sharp groan. I bolted out of the room, gasping for air, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart still hammering in my chest. But I knew that it wasn't over. It wasn't just Caleb anymore. Whatever had been inside him, whatever had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, was still here, still watching. Peter was still asleep, unaware of the nightmare I'd just witnessed. I wanted to wake him, wanted to scream and tell him what had happened, but I couldn't. I couldn't explain what I had seen, what I had felt. How could I? How could anyone believe that our son, the child we'd adopted with so much hope, was a vessel for something so evil? The whispers still echoed in my mind, their words relentless. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a haunting, this wasn't just a nightmare, it was something much darker, something that had been waiting, biding its time. And now it was finally free. The moment Caleb stepped into our home, I knew something wasn't right. It was subtle at first, a flicker in his eyes, a shift in the air. But the longer he stayed with us, the more I realized that someone was inside him, watching us, waiting. I had no idea how to help him, or even if it was possible. The silence was overwhelming, suffocating. He didn't speak, didn't interact like a child should. It was like living with a ghost, but worse, because at least ghosts are supposed to be dead. Caleb was alive, but not in the way I expected. When the drawings started appearing, I thought I was imagining things at first. But then I found one, and then another, and another, each one more unsettling than the last. Faces twisted in agony, symbols I didn't understand, eyes that didn't blink, staring at me from the paper. I tried to dismiss it as the product of a troubled child's mind, but the more I looked at those drawings, the more I felt something was pulling at me from behind them. And then came the whispers. They started quietly, almost like a breeze, but they quickly grew louder, more distinct. I heard them in the dead of night coming from Caleb's room, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was in the house with us. Something dark, something that had been waiting. I had to know what was happening. I had to know what had taken hold of my son. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were too loud, too constant. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, each step heavier than the last. As I reached Caleb's door, I could feel the chill in the air. It wasn't the normal cold of a house at night. No, this was something else. A cold that didn't just touch your skin, it settled deep in your bones. I pushed the door open. Caleb was sitting in the corner facing the wall, his back perfectly still, like a doll. I whispered his name, but there was no response. His body was so rigid, so unnatural, and the longer I stared at him, the more I felt like I was being swallowed by the room. I should have turned back. I should have run. But I didn't. I had to know what was happening to my son. I called his name again, still nothing. And then, slowly, Caleb turned his head. It wasn't like a normal child turning to look at you. It was slow, unnaturally slow, like the movement was being forced, like he wasn't in control. And when his eyes met mine, I almost fell back against the wall. Those eyes weren't Caleb's. They were dark, black, deep voids that seemed to consume everything around them. There was no warmth, no recognition, just emptiness. And that's when I felt it. It wasn't him, it wasn't my son. The room felt heavier. The air thickened, like it was pressing in from all sides. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The whispers grew louder, their voices wrapping around my mind, clawing at my sanity. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body refused to move. My heart hammered in my chest, but the words were stuck in my throat. And then, the thing inside Caleb spoke. But it wasn't Caleb's voice. It was deep, guttural, and it rattled my very bones. You shouldn't have come here. I staggered back, but I couldn't move fast enough. The room was closing in on me, the walls pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I tried to speak, to tell Caleb that I loved him, that I was here to help, but the words wouldn't come. The thing inside him wasn't interested in love. It wasn't interested in anything but destruction. The voice rasped again, sending a jolt of terror through my spine. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have taken him. And then, the most horrifying thing of all, Caleb's lips twisted into a smile. But it wasn't a smile. No, it was a grotesque, unnatural curl of his mouth, wide and stretching in ways that made no sense. His teeth were sharp, jagged. His face seemed to shift, as if the very flesh on his bones was wrong, stretched too far. I couldn't take it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I needed to get out. But when I tried to move toward the door, I realized I couldn't. The door was locked. No, not locked. It wouldn't open. I pounded on the door, frantic, my palms slick with sweat. It was like the house itself had become a prison, trapping me inside with whatever was controlling Caleb. The whispers grew louder, filling the space around me, drowning out every other sound. They were coming from everywhere. Inside the walls, inside my head. You took him. Now you must pay. And then the air grew colder. So cold I could see my breath, even though the furnace was running. I was shaking now, trembling uncontrollably, my body frozen in terror. I couldn't see straight, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I was trapped. I didn't know what to do. But then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the door flew open. The sound of it slamming against the wall was deafening. I don't remember running, but I must have. I must have stumbled out of that room, my body shaking, my heart racing. Because the next thing I knew, I was standing in the hallway, gasping for air. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. I looked around, my eyes wide with terror. But Peter, he was still asleep. He had no idea. He couldn't hear it. He couldn't see what I saw. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even form the words. How could I tell him? How could I tell him that the child we had brought into our home wasn't our son? How could I explain that something had taken over him? Something ancient, something malevolent, something that had been waiting for years. That's when I called Margaret. Margaret had always been different. She could feel things, sense things that no one else could. She had always been the odd one in the family, but I knew, deep down, that if anyone could help me, it was her. When she arrived, I didn't know what to expect, but I wasn't ready for what I saw. She stepped out of the car slowly, like she had known what was coming. Her eyes were tired, haunted, but there was a quiet, steely resolve about her that made my heart race. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, as if she had expected this, as if she had known it would come to this. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice steady, but her eyes searching the house like they were already reading it, like she could already sense the evil lurking inside. She didn't even flinch when she saw Caleb. When she stepped into the room, she didn't hesitate. Her gaze didn't waver, but I saw the flicker in her eyes when she looked at him. She knew. She knew. And when Caleb, the thing inside Caleb, looked at her, something in the room shifted. Something moved. Margaret didn't flinch. "I know what's inside him," she said, her voice calm, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the air around Caleb. "And I know how to make it leave." And just like that, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. I don't know when I first began to suspect that Caleb wasn't just quiet. It wasn't a gradual realization, but more like a sudden drop into something deep and dark, a feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. At first, I told myself it was nothing. He was quiet, he was withdrawn. He'd been through so much already. Too much. But deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't just his trauma. Something else was going on, something darker. When I found the drawings, I didn't know what to think. They weren't like the innocent scribbles I'd expected. There was a darkness to them. Faces, eyes too wide and too empty, staring at me from the walls, from the papers Caleb scattered across his room. I tried to tell myself it was just a child's imagination, that he was processing his emotions. But I could feel it in my bones, that there was something else there, something watching, something waiting. And then the whispers started. I heard them in the dead of night, like the faintest hum of a distant storm. At first, I thought I was imagining it, stress, lack of sleep, but no. It was real. It was coming from Caleb's room, from the shadows. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't dismiss it anymore. Something was inside him, something not human. I had to know. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge, constantly wondering what was happening to my son. So I did what I thought was the only thing left to do. I called Margaret. Margaret was always different. She had this sensitivity about her, something that seemed to give her an understanding of the world beyond the one I could see. When I called her, she didn't hesitate. She knew something was wrong, just from the tone in my voice. But when she arrived, her face, oh God, the way she looked at me, was full of something I couldn't place. Something heavy, something dark. She didn't speak much at first. I could tell she was sensing something I couldn't feel, but I didn't know what. I didn't know if I wanted to know. But I led her to Caleb's room, and the moment she stepped inside, I saw it in her eyes. I saw the understanding, the recognition. She felt it. She felt the darkness that had taken hold of him. Margaret stood there, still, her hand outstretched as if trying to touch the air itself, sensing the invisible presence. She didn't flinch, didn't react. She was connected to whatever was inside Caleb, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, too calm for what we were facing. "It's not just a haunting," she said. "It's a curse." I felt my heart stop. A curse? What was she talking about? "The house wasn't always yours, Anna," she continued, her voice low, almost reverent. "It used to belong to a family. They lived here before you. Their son was named Samuel. The name sent a shiver through me. It didn't make sense. I didn't know who Samuel was, but Margaret was speaking with such certainty, her eyes clouded with something I couldn't understand, and I knew then that whatever she was about to say, it would change everything. "They were murdered," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper, like the words were too terrible to speak aloud. "Samuel's family, slaughtered. And it wasn't just a murder, it wasn't just a random act of violence. No, it was a ritual." My stomach twisted. Murder? A ritual? What was she talking about? My head spun, trying to grasp what she was saying. My legs felt weak beneath me. I couldn't breathe. "They thought they could gain power from their bloodline," Margaret went on, her face pale, her eyes dark with the weight of the words. "The cult, they, believed Samuel's family had something special in their blood. Something that could open a doorway, a gateway to power." I felt my body tremble, as if the very air around me had shifted, as if the walls themselves were closing in. What was she saying? A gateway? A doorway? I could barely process the words. They didn't make sense. But Margaret wasn't done. She wasn't finished with her story. "Samuel," she said, her voice now full of sorrow, "wasn't just killed. He was part of the ritual. They sacrificed him. But it didn't work the way they thought. The bloodline they tried to use to open that gateway, it wasn't just used up, it bound them. Samuel's spirit, his family's spirits, they were trapped here, in this house." My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. My mind was spinning, trying to piece it all together, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The house, the cold air, the whispers, the darkness. It had always felt like something was watching us, something waiting. Margaret stepped closer to Caleb, her eyes not leaving him for a moment. "Caleb," she said softly, "he's not just a victim, he's the vessel." The word vessel hit me like a physical blow. I staggered back, gripping the doorframe, trying to steady myself. Caleb, my son, wasn't just being haunted, he was being used. His body, his soul, had been chosen as a conduit for something dark, something ancient. Samuel's spirit, Margaret continued, found him. Found the bloodline, and he took it. He took Caleb's body, using it to finish the ritual. He wants revenge, Anna. He wants to make those who killed his family pay. My heart was hammering in my chest. The room was spinning, the edges of my vision fading. I couldn't think. I couldn't speak. The child I had taken into my home, the boy I had tried to love, was gone. Something else had taken over him. Something that had been waiting for years, lying in wait for the right moment. And now that moment had come. Margaret turned to me, her expression full of sorrow, full of pity. "He's not just a boy anymore, Hannah. He's the key. The spirit of Samuel needs him to complete what was started. And unless you stop it, unless you break the curse, it will never end. Samuel will never leave. He'll keep using Caleb until there's nothing left." Tears filled my eyes as I looked at Caleb. His empty eyes stared at nothing, his body unmoving, his soul gone. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to save him. "You have to stop it, Anna," Margaret said, her voice firm. "The curse, you have to end it." How could I end it? How could I stop a spirit that had been waiting for so long? How could I fight something this strong? My legs gave out beneath me and I collapsed to my knees, my mind whirling with impossible thoughts. But Margaret's words echoed in my mind. There was no escaping this, no running from what had been set in motion. The curse had already begun, and now it was up to me to finish it, or let it destroy everything. It started so innocently. Caleb, my son, was quiet, yes, but I told myself it was just because of the trauma he had experienced. The adoption had been a long journey, and I had expected him to take some time to adjust. But soon, I realized that this wasn't just silence. There was something wrong. There was something inside him that didn't belong. It wasn't the typical silence of a shy child or a reserved boy. It was an unsettling stillness, as if he was empty. The way he moved, the way he looked at me with those dark, unblinking eyes. It wasn't just that he was quiet. It felt like he was waiting for something. Something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then came the drawings. The first one was simple, a face. But the eyes, those eyes were so deep, so hollow, that they seemed to follow me no matter where I went. And then, the other drawings came. Twisted faces, figures that were contorted and grotesque, with eyes staring out of the paper. Hungry, like they wanted something from me. I tried to dismiss it, told myself it was just the result of a child's imagination. But deep down, something told me that it wasn't. Something was trying to communicate with me through these images. The whispers came next. It started softly, just a murmur in the middle of the night, too faint to fully understand. I brushed it off as the house settling, or maybe the wind outside, but the next night it was louder, more distinct. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. The whispers didn't come from anywhere specific, but they felt like they were coming from inside the house, creeping in from the walls, the corners, the shadows. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was happening to Caleb. So, one night, when the whispers grew louder again, I decided to confront him. I crept into his room, heart pounding in my chest, and found him sitting in the corner. His back was to me, and he wasn't moving. He didn't even acknowledge my presence as I approached. His body was unnaturally still, like a doll, and for a moment I stood there, frozen, watching him. The whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears, but when I looked at Caleb, I realized that it wasn't him speaking. It wasn't him anymore. When he finally turned to face me, I saw it. His eyes, those empty, soulless eyes staring back at me. I took a step back, but my legs were shaking, my mind racing to understand what was happening. His eyes were black, deep, endless voids, pulling the light from the room. There was nothing there, nothing human, just darkness. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't Caleb's voice. It was a low, guttural whisper, thick with malice, and it sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. I froze. The voice wasn't just coming from him, it was coming from the walls, from the very air around me. It filled the room, curling around my mind, pressing on my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only stand there, paralyzed by fear, staring at Caleb, or what had once been Caleb. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice repeated, louder this time, and I felt it. I felt the weight of it, the weight of something pressing down on me, crushing me under the sheer force of its presence. And then, Caleb, or whatever was inside him, smiled. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't even a grimace. It was a mockery. His mouth stretched wide, unnaturally so, the corners of his lips splitting open in a way that no child's face should ever move. His teeth were sharp, jagged, like they didn't belong to a child. His skin was pale, almost gray, and the air in the room grew colder with every passing second. I turned to flee, but the door wouldn't open. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I felt as though the walls were closing in on me, pressing me into the floor, trapping me in the room with that thing that wasn't my son. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed again, and I realized with horror that I was no longer in control of my own thoughts. The house, the air, the very space I occupied, it was all alive with this thing that had taken Caleb's body and was using it as a puppet, as a vessel. It had been waiting. It had been trapped in this house, waiting for the right moment to claim what it had always been promised. And it had found its moment. The door finally slammed open with a loud crash, and I bolted out into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran down the stairs, my legs barely able to carry me, but the moment I stepped into the living room, I stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was Margaret. My sister. She had come. She looked at me, her face a mixture of horror and understanding. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. She had known. She had felt it too. "Anna," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "It's not just a ghost. It's not just a spirit. It's him, the boy who lived here before." Margaret's words hit me like a cold slap. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to hear it. But her eyes were full of something deeper now, something ancient, and I realized that she wasn't telling me this to comfort me. She was telling me this because she knew what I had suspected all along. The house, the bloodline, the curse, it was all real. And Caleb, my son, had become the vessel for something far darker than I could ever have imagined. "His name was Samuel," Margaret said, her voice low, almost reverent. "And he was the one who died in this house. He was the one they murdered." I didn't understand. Murdered? By who? Why? They didn't just kill him, Anna. They bound his spirit to this house, to this land. And now he's taken Caleb. He's using him. He wants his revenge. The room seemed to close in around me as Margaret's words settled in my mind, heavy and suffocating. The thing inside Caleb wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a curse. And I had brought it into my home. "I can't stop it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't stop him." Margaret's eyes softened with sympathy, but there was nothing she could say. The curse was too strong. And as I looked at Samuel, standing there, his eyes wide and empty, I realized with sickening clarity that the battle was over. The spirit had taken full control. I had always thought of our home as a sanctuary, a place of safety. But now, as I stand in the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts I can barely hold on to, I realize I've been wrong. It was never a sanctuary. This house was a prison, a trap. And the child I took in with the hope of healing was never mine to save. The whispers began innocently enough, just faint murmurs that I thought were my imagination or the house settling. But soon the voices became louder, more persistent. It was like they were alive, swirling around me, speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself it was nothing, but every night they grew louder, more insistent. I could no longer pretend I didn't hear them. It wasn't just the whispers. There were the drawings too. The disturbing, twisted figures Caleb had drawn all over the walls. Faces, eyes, too many eyes watching me. The moment I laid eyes on them, I felt it, the presence. Something ancient, something evil. I tried to brush it off, to explain it away as a child's outlet for unspoken fears. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a child's fear, it was something else. And then Caleb started moving. Not in a way that made sense. His body jerked and twitched in unnatural ways, like he was being pulled by strings. his limbs stiff and unyielding. He didn't speak, he didn't look at me, but I could feel it, the weight of something that wasn't him. The house was no longer our home. It was a place of waiting, and whatever had taken Caleb, whatever had claimed him, wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I remember the first night I truly understood what was happening. I stood outside Caleb's room, my hand on the door handle, heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the air in the house felt thick, suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed the door open. Caleb was sitting in the corner of his room, his back to me, his head tilted at an odd angle, as though he were listening to something just out of reach. I called his name, but he didn't respond, he didn't move. And then, slowly, his head turned, unnaturally slowly, and his eyes met mine. Those eyes, they weren't Caleb's, they couldn't have been, they were black, empty, hollow. And in that moment, in that instant when our gazes locked, I knew. I knew that the child I had taken in, the child I had promised to protect, was no longer mine. It was inside him now, the thing that had been waiting, the thing that had taken him. The voice came then, deep, guttural, and not Caleb's at all. "You shouldn't have come here." The words vibrated through my body, like they were coming from the walls, from the very air itself. I could feel the heat leave my body, replaced by ice, by something dark and cold. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I couldn't move, my legs wouldn't obey. My breath caught in my throat as the thing that was inside Caleb grinned. A twisted, horrible grin. The smile wasn't human, it was wrong. I staggered back, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. But it wouldn't open. The door that had always been so easy to push was now locked. But it wasn't the kind of lock you could simply twist with your hand. No, this was something far worse. It was as though the house itself was holding me in, keeping me from leaving, keeping me from escaping the nightmare that was unfolding before me. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered again. And I knew it was no longer Caleb's voice. No, it was deeper. It was older. It was the thing that had waited for so long to be freed. I stumbled back, my body fighting to escape the overwhelming darkness that had taken over Caleb. I could hear the voice again, rising from Caleb's lips, but it wasn't his words. It was something else entirely. "I've been waiting for you to come." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The weight of the room pressed down on me, and I thought for sure I was going to suffocate under the sheer force of whatever this thing was. The whispers grew louder, their voices melding into a single, chilling roar. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't work. The sound was inside me now, inside my mind. The thing inside Caleb wanted something. It wanted me. The door finally gave way with a violent crash. I ran. I don't remember how I got downstairs, how I managed to move, but I found myself in the living room, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I was trembling, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled for my phone. I didn't know who to call. Who could help? Who could stop this? And then I remembered Margaret. Margaret, my sister, the one who had always seen things, felt things others couldn't. She had to know, she had to understand. I called her. My voice cracked when I spoke. "Margaret, you have to come. Something's wrong. Caleb, he's not Caleb. Something's inside him." I don't remember the exact words I said, but I remember the urgency in her voice when she replied, "I'm coming. Stay calm. I'm on my way." I didn't know how long it would take her to get here. I didn't know if I could hold on that long. And then, in the distance, I heard it. The soft thud of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be human. I turned, my eyes wild, searching for the source of the sound, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't anyone I knew, and then I saw him, Caleb, or rather, Samuel. The figure in the doorway was tall, much taller than Caleb had been. His face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over bone, and his eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto mine. His lips twisted into a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. It was cruel. It was full of hatred, of rage. "You took him! You brought him here!" the voice rasped, and I could hear the malevolence in it, the power that had been unleashed. "Now you will pay." I backed away, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't move fast enough. The thing inside Caleb, it was here. It had taken him completely, and I knew in that moment that there was no going back. The thing that had been waiting for so long had fully taken control. Caleb, my son, was gone, and the spirit, Samuel, was in charge now. I remember the first night Caleb stepped into our home. He was so quiet, his small body almost swallowed up by the overwhelming silence that filled the house. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a new beginning, as I had hoped, but something else. It was thick, suffocating. Something had already claimed this house before I even realized it. At first, I thought it was just his trauma, his past. He'd been through so much, and I told myself that this quietness, this distance was just him processing all of it. But then I started to notice the strange things. His stillness, the way he would sit for hours, his eyes vacant, staring at nothing. The way he would draw, no, scribble, on the walls, on scraps of paper, his tiny fingers making shapes and faces that made no sense to me. The figures were twisted, dark. The eyes, they were wrong. Every drawing seemed to be full of eyes, watching, judging. It wasn't something a 7-year-old should be thinking about. It wasn't right. The first night I heard the whispers, I told myself it was just the wind. The house was old, the floors creaked. But soon I realized that it wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't the wind howling outside. It was something else, something darker. The whispers grew louder every night, and they were never in a language I understood. The words didn't even sound human. They were guttural, like something was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. I could hear them as I lay in bed, my heart pounding, my mind too terrified to even move. I wanted to confront Caleb, but something inside me told me not to. Something inside me told me that if I did, I would be letting whatever it was out of its cage. But I couldn't keep avoiding it. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't feel the weight of it all. Something had changed. Something had taken hold of Caleb. And I wasn't sure if I could save him, or if I even should. One night, when the whispers became too much to bear, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I crept down the hallway toward his room, my body trembling with fear. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But I didn't, I couldn't. I pushed open the door. Caleb was sitting in the corner of his room, his back to me. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his body still like a statue. I called his name, my voice barely a whisper, but he didn't respond. His head didn't turn, he didn't move. I stepped forward, each footfall heavy and slow, but still no response, and then he turned. It wasn't Caleb's usual hesitant gaze. No, his head turned, but it was wrong, too slow, too deliberate. His eyes locked onto mine, but they weren't his eyes. No, they were empty, hollow. They were black. Not dark brown like a child's eyes should be, but black. And when they met mine, I felt my blood run cold. And then it spoke. But it wasn't Caleb's voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The words slithered into my mind, scraping against my thoughts like nails on a chalkboard. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mouth dry, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating air of the room with whatever had taken my son. The voice came again, deeper now, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have taken him." The words echoed in my mind, louder this time, until it was all I could hear. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me. My hand reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The door that had always opened so easily, the door that had never given me trouble before, wouldn't open. I was trapped. And then Caleb, or whatever was inside him, smiled. It wasn't a smile, not like a child's smile. It was twisted. It was cruel. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and his teeth, sharp, jagged, gleamed in the dim light of the room. His face contorted, not like a child's face at all, but something much older, much darker. I could hear the laughter then. It was cold, hollow, and it didn't come from Caleb's lips. It came from the walls, from the very air around me. It was mocking. It was alive. It was evil. I didn't know what to do. I was choking on fear, suffocating under the weight of what I was seeing. It was like the house had turned against me, like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating me. I could feel it in my chest. The air was thick, too cold. And then, before I could even process what was happening, the door flew open. I don't know how. I don't know who did it. But it slammed open and I ran. I didn't stop running. I found myself in the living room, gasping for air, my legs shaking beneath me. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't even feel my fingertips. I felt like I was losing control of everything. My mind was reeling, and yet nothing made sense. The whispers in my head grew louder still, until I could barely hear myself think. I was on the edge, teetering between reality and something else, something much darker. And then I remembered. Margaret. I called her. My voice broke as I spoke, as if I had been holding my breath for too long. "Margaret, I need you. Please, help me. Something's wrong with Caleb. He's not Caleb anymore." I didn't even know what I expected from her. I didn't know if she could help, but I couldn't do this alone. Margaret arrived faster than I thought possible. She was there, standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes filled with the same terror I had felt. She stepped into the house without a word, her eyes scanning the room, the hallway. She knew. She didn't need to be told. She felt it. She didn't need to ask questions. She had seen the darkness, felt it herself. She knew what was inside Caleb, and standing there she didn't offer any comfort. There was nothing she could say to make me feel better. She knew that this was something I had to face on my own. But as much as she tried to help, as much as she tried to offer her advice, I knew that there was no hope left. Whatever had claimed Caleb, whatever had taken him from me, was too strong. He was gone, and I knew then, with the full weight of it crashing down on me, that I couldn't save him. Not anymore. I had lost him. I had lost my son, and I had no idea how to get him back. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.